All right, let's talk about another exploitative line here, something I've seen a lot of over the years. How to identify this situation and how we can exploit it, as this is a spot where I think a lot of even professional players kind of misread the situation, and one that it's very easy to say, oh, my opponent took a stupid line, I had to pay it off. But if we actually take a little more time and put ourselves in our opponent's shoes and really understand the situation, we can make some really exploitative tight folds in this scenario. So this is all about facing delayed aggression post flop from mostly type 5 players. You'll see this most often against tight recreational players, although some type 3 and type 4 as well. So we'll say mostly coming from type players, whether that be pro or recreational, and then occasionally from a type 4 player. Although we have to be careful taking this line against type 4 players for a lot of reasons we'll talk about later. And this exploit we can really use against players who are not capable of running big bluffs post flop and often take sort of strange lines with big hands, especially in position. So I want to look at this example first, and then we'll kind of go through the identifiers and the triggers and what we're going to do. But let's take a look at this hand I played from the Maryland main event recently. Playing against a type 5 opponent, tight recreational, and we open queen's middle position at 1600 big blind, playing 100K, so something like 50, 70 blinds, somewhere in there. Button calls, type 5 player, tight recreational, big blind calls as well. We get an 8-3-2 rainbow board, big blind checks, we bet quarter pot, button calls, and big blind folds. 8-3-2 rainbow, we're feeling good about our hand, small bet, pretty standard here, multi-way. We probably could have mixed in some big bet as well, but I went small this time. Turn comes the 3 of hearts, pairs the 3. I check the tight rec in on the button checks as well. And on the 7 river, I size up and bet the pot here. And type 5 player now puts in a raise to 45K. And this is kind of where our exploit comes into play here. So, a lot of things to think about here. This is always a spot where I feel like the relative strength of our hand in regards to hands of medium strength or strong strength, but not the nuts, is pretty irrelevant, because especially when we bet the pot on the river, or we're making a big river bet and then facing a raise from a tight player, it doesn't matter too much if we have ace 8 here or pocket kings. They're all kind of doing very poorly against his value range. So I think that's an important distinction to make when you do find yourself in this spot facing this raise, that it doesn't really matter what you have unless you have a full house. And I think even with a hand like pocket twos here, I would be in the tank here thinking about, I have kind of the low end of his value range when he's raising when I have pocket twos here. And you really see this a lot from players when it is value and this kind of button taking this line where he checks back the nuts on the turn. You see it a lot on boards with full houses like this, so the 8-3-2 that pairs the 3, or flush completers. I often see it a lot too, where flush draw on the flop, the flush completes on the turn, and they'll check back the ace high flush on the turn to raise the river. And this is something I've seen a lot over the years. Definitely seen enough showdowns that this falls into kind of a common exploit category and something worth making a video about. But keeping all that stuff in mind, that when you get to the river in this spot, we're kind of throwing our hand out the window, where it doesn't matter too much what we have here if it's not a full house. But what matters is what's more likely. This type 5 tight recreational player is going to make a bluff in a big pot on the river, a raised bluff versus a pot size bet on one hand, or he took a kind of goofy line and checked back the nuts on the turn. Those are the only two considerations you really need to make when kind of assessing this river situation. And I almost always find that it's the goofy line that's going to be the more prevalent strategy than him actually having a bluff here versus the big bet on the river. Very rarely have I called in this scenario and had the best hand. So I actually fold here, and this is kind of what we should be doing to exploit this weird line that type players are taking. And I want to go through the triggers here and what we kind of should look for in this scenario. So, triggers, identifiers, usually we're out of position in this spot. Occasionally it can happen in position, but really doesn't happen too much because these players will often put in a check raise when playing out of position earlier in the hand. And they seem to favor this line when in position and checking back on the turn. So this will happen when we're out of position on the river, usually against a type 3 or type 5 player, primarily type 5. And the other identifier, the kind of thing that happens, we're value betting. Doesn't really matter if we're bluffing here. So we're value betting and face a river raise versus an opponent who checked back the turn and in theory should have some kind of capped range where his river raise doesn't make a ton of sense theoretically. Like we're always going to do in this course, instead of just saying, oh, it's a bad play, like let's understand the play. Let's put ourselves in the type 5 player's shoes and why are they making this play? What are they doing? So let's say we have pocket eights here on this 832 rainbow board. We face a small bet and we call. They check to us on the turn and we check back. And their logic here, if I were to kind of speculate, is thinking they're going to catch some bluffs first off on the river while disguising the strength of their hand, aka kind of like setting a trap here. And also, I mean, I've spoke with a lot of recreational players over the years, done some coaching, and their logic is pretty interesting. And a lot of times they go to the logic of opponent may not suspect I'd check such a strong hand on the turn. And while that is true, there is some flaws in that logic as opponent also does not suspect you would raise bluff the river. And that's kind of the more important logic that they're not counting in there. But that's kind of the basis of this play, that they're setting this trap that they're going to spring on the river, but not really thinking about what it does to their overall range and their overall strategy on the turn and river. And our response to this line, and really this line does poorly compared to just betting the turn and betting the river against type 1 players and observant players, is just we're going to have to make huge folds here because their river raising range contains very few bluffs, typically 0. And we have to realize villains are not capped at all here. So this type 5 player range is not capped when he checks back the turn. And it's actually quite the opposite when you see this kind of combination of events where villain checks back turn and then raises river, and it's a tighter player, a recreational player. We're going to weight them much more towards hands that are kind of stone nut type combos, full houses, flushes, nothing kind of in the middle where very rarely will you see like a thin value raise here with this line. I mean, occasionally I've seen like a goofy slow played aces, for example, on that 832 board. Maybe that would be a small portion of his range. But again, when you're facing the big bet on the river, when the tight player is facing a big bet on the river, I've also seen them snap call in this spot with aces and really not even consider raising. So it does depend on exactly what type of player you're playing against. But in general, this is going to be a ton of value in the very highest end of hand strength. So another thing to think about too is your image. And note that if you are known as a loose or aggressive player, villains may use this line more frequently against you. So kind of thinking the first part of their logic being in that, oh, if I check back on the turn here, I'm going to get him to bet on the river with his bluffs. And then when he has value, I'll raise him and maybe he'll call. That's definitely part of our opponent's logic here that we need to think about and kind of consider your own image when obviously we're still going to value bet this river, but thinking about how often they're going to make this play. Like I said, when you get to this spot on the river, really need to do your best to kind of throw aside the absolute strength of your hand and kind of the irrationality of our opponent's line and just ask yourself, what is more likely? Did they check back a huge hand on the turn, or are they making a big river raise bluff against me? As tournament players know, and we've kind of seen over the years, rarely is this going to be a bluff with the river raise from a tight recreational player. So really being able to kind of throw the absolute strength of your hand out the window and make these tight exploitative folds is going to save us a lot of chips and money in the long run.